don't know. I'm not so sure.
You can record, but we would like to own the tape.
Well, let's discuss this. So once again, thank you so much for those that could join. We are planning to stay 1 hour and something. So the other meetings that we had were around 1 hour and a half, 2 hours in the case of the discussion that Judy and Larry we had like what 3 weeks ago. So since we are the 7 of us, please let's start with some small presentations. Where are we from? Why are we here? And so on. So yeah, let's start with Luisa, please.
Sure. Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to somehow hold this conversation together. So I'm Louisa. For those of you I've never met before, I did have the chance to meet Judy and Larry last time. So good to see you again. I am head of a Bulgarian organization that is called Sofia Platform. We work in the realm of history and civic education. And as part of our activities, we've launched a partnership project currently that is focusing on the so-called civic deserts for Central and Eastern European countries. That's Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Poland. And we're trying to explore a little bit better what that means, but also to sort of twist the conversation around those places so that they're not marked as deficient, but rather to look at what's happening there. So to look at their assets rather than the needs and the deficiencies. And I might go a little bit further into detail later on when we start the discussion, the conversation, to explain a little bit more what is the mapping and the research we've done so far about the so-called civic deserts. As of me, I am political scientist by training, and in a previous life was active in foreign policy, and now focus entirely on democracy and civics, predominantly on local level and rural areas in Central and Eastern Europe.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Claudia?
Yes, hi. I think it's the first time when I'm seeing people. I might have heard some of you over a phone when I connected the previous times. I'm wearing so many hats. I have to, to pick one for now. So basically why I'm here at this conversation is because my dissertation, which I did at University of Illinois, was on the history of public libraries during the communist regime. And I've learned about how public institutions used to work in communism, and I see them functioning now because I'm still working with libraries. I'm working now in part of the NGO. I used to be the director of the National Library. I saw how a national institution work a couple of years ago. So I could understand how this very old structure is still functioning. And what I'm doing now with EduCub and with other projects is trying to figure out how to implode the system and make it work in a different way to actually help people and not just use people. And this is why what Luisa does is so interesting to me, because they're deserts. People are starving for resources, are starving for connection. I'm working with rural libraries in a number of projects in Romania and Moldova, and now also in Ukraine. And they don't have the resources. They don't have the trust. They don't have the knowledge. They don't have what people could use. And when they have, they try to actually give it away to the public. So with EduCub, what we do and what I really love about EduCub is that we're trying to connect what they need with what is available. And this way we really make it very efficient for resources to reach the grassroots efforts. And yeah, this is why I'm here. I'm trying to figure out how to actually make this efficient, because I do want to see things happening in my lifetime.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Claudia. You've noticed that I was like inviting people to present themselves. It's not hectic. It's in the order of appearing in the discussion and in this online event. So I would ask, before I'm asking you, Judy and Larry, to say a few words about what you are doing and planning to do. I also want to welcome those that joined meanwhile, Andrea, Salut, Alexandra, Nikolai, and Misha. Okay, and just to tell you what we are doing, we are making a round, you know, we are taking a round to present ourselves, a few words of why are we interested in the subject and what are we doing. Thank you. So Judy, Larry.
I think we're probably tangential to this. We talked before with most of you, but we're retired but very active in things here, from immigration to other things in the U.S. But I mainly wanted to have an opportunity to have John Clippinger hear from you today what the challenges are that you face, and then have a discussion together. So if you don't mind, I won't go into any more detail about us, but we can go ahead, Mahetza, and hear from these other folks about who they are and their backgrounds.
Unmute myself. Thank you very much. Chris.
Hello, my name is Chris Bratu. I'm from Romania, a member of an NGO called Pro-Democracy. It deals with strengthening democracy in Romania by increasing civic participation. So we're interested in transparency in public institutions, of course, free access to information, the way the political parties are financed, the way the political campaigns are conducted, free and fair elections.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And Andrea.
Inviting me.
Hello. Mihai, this seems to be a very select group. I think you cherry-picked us, and I don't know what I did to deserve the ticket, you know, like the golden ticket to this discussion. I'm currently working with the Federation of Community Foundations in Romania. I work project-based, coordinating the communication part within a national project. And I also collaborate with the Community Foundation of Galați. And maybe this is more connected to the idea of civic deserts, because I live in a less fortunate part of Romania, which is near the border with Basarabia/Russia. And this is considered to be a less connected, less resourceful part of Romania. So more of a civic desert than other Western parts of the same country. So yeah, maybe it's a local, native part in me who wants to know more about this.
Excellent. Thank you. And Nikolai, welcome. Can you hear us?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, but we cannot see
Yeah,
you.
I can hear you.
I hope you are dressed right properly for this meeting.
See
So-
if I can. All right.
Yeah.
There's me. So, unfortunately, I'm like stuck in a mall. So I'm just going to listen more. But generally, I'm teaching for many years in Bulgaria. And last year, I finished a documentary on education. Luisa actually was one of our consultants. It helped quite a lot. And education in general is changing, not because of the only coronavirus, but it's really the best tool to change society, and the best tool to like empower teachers, empower parents, because parents in Bulgaria are quite inadequate to how to work with the institutions. They still are stuck in a mindset with communist ideas. And basically, these are the main topics that interest me.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I mean, I have to say that everybody that spoke here were very modest. I mean, I know all of you, and starting from Judy and Larry, who are a true inspiration for anyone that know your, you know, the history of what you've done so far and what you're doing currently, and you're planning to do to the rest of the people. And thank you so much for being with us. John, thank you so much.
There are two more people here.
One more.
Claudia.
No, Claudia.
No, I mean,
Claudia.
Claudia and Alexandra.
Alexandra, where is Alexandra? She joined? Yes,
Hi,
Alexandra
I
joined.
did.
Well, so Claudia already told us a few things. Alexandra, I'm so happy you've joined. What we are trying to make a tour de la table.
Yes, I was here listening.
So tell
hi,
us a
everyone.
little bit about you.
Yeah, it's a privilege to be here. I feel similarly to Andrea that it's all the right people. So I feel a bit like an outsider because I'm not working within any organization. I work as a consultant, helping community organizations consider participation. So let's say a participation consultant. I've been working for the past 3 years with community foundations, and they are really special in Romania because they have grown incredibly in less than 10 years. There are 19 of them active, or yeah, most of them active. And it's a, let's say it's a success case study in the region, so Central and Eastern Europe. And the reason why they're wonderfully attractive as a format is because they take into consideration local context, and they say we want to develop civil society at its grassroots with the resources we have locally. So it's a beautiful philosophy. It's based on philanthropy, but it's community philanthropy. So it's sort of skirts a bit the big issues with philanthropy more generally. And it's been a pleasure to work with them. Most recently, I collaborated with Andrea in a project, so I'm really happy that she's here as well. So yeah, excited about this conversation. Thanks so much, Mihai, for organizing this as always.
Excellent, thank you so much. And just to tell you that this series of events, of dialogues were, we've started in a conversation that Alexandra and I had like 1 hour and, well, a little bit more than 1 year ago. And then the first event was with John McKnight, and we had actually 2 events with John McKnight, one with Christine Gray and Edgar Kahn, then with Dave Snowden, and the last one with Judy and Larry, who were very kind to participate. And the whole idea behind it is that we want to create a space where professionals that are doing grassroots work are interacting with the people that already started and developed projects that proved to be successful, or at least there were some big learnings from those initiatives. And the last thing before passing to you, John, is that I want to say that Alexandra, Luisa, and I, we were a part of the Young Leaders programs in different generations, but we were part of the Young Leaders programs of Aspen, Romania. And I know that you are very involved with the work of Aspen. So just to make a connection, I'm not, and Claudia and I, we were in the same generation, and Luisa and Alexandra were together in a previous generation.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is quite a impressive group of people, and I look forward to having a conversation and learning more from you about what you're doing and how it relates to some of the things that we're doing. And my experience and my background is not very well developed in Eastern Europe, so I'd be very interested in the kind of projects that you're involved in, where things are. Just to get a little background and context, right now, in the last 10 years or so, I've been at the MIT Media Lab. And it's a interdisciplinary, what they like to call a transdisciplinary institution that tries to bring in. It's not based upon particular academic disciplines, but trying to solve certain classes of problems. And the big focus here in my work at MIT for the last 10 years has been on the whole question of giving people control over their identity and their data, and then how to create new kinds of institutions that are accountable, transparent, and responsive to the communities in which they're a part. And a lot of work that we're doing now is based upon digital technologies. And there's a lot of work that's come out of being able to get data off of cell phone data and use that data to make predictions about what people are doing, a better design, better planning. And then I've been involved in the whole birth of what people call tokenomics, the sort of digital currencies, blockchain, what's happened there, the whole decentralized notion of moving into a network society, making it more decentralized, more bottom-up, more peer-to-peer. And that has a lot of implications for kinds of institutional designs and how people participate in the community. So it's a very different framing of looking at sort of how to address the current problems that we've been focusing on now principally on climate change, and feeling that we have a very limited period of time in which to make very dramatic changes. And then also the social equity issues. And then then you have the pandemic coming in, and that has accelerated things. So I think we're going through a phase of rapid transition where technologies are fundamentally altering the space in which we can address our problems. We're also looking at some new kind of economic models that are sort of post-capitalist, in the sense that the problem with capitalism is that it creates externalities, and that these externalities, negative externalities, particularly in the climate, and that you generally have the public sector or the nonprofit sector trying to address these, but the externalities has gotten so monumental, so structural, that unless we build institutions that themselves designed from the very beginning to address these issues of equity and climate change, we're not going to be able to address them in a sufficient time period. And what's happened recently in the US is there really is an uprising. It's just amazing to see what's happened. There's a new sense of what is a new reality instead of what is fair. That system has not worked. There's just a visceral revolt. And it's just not induced, I think, by Trump. I think it's a recognition of the systemic failures we have here. So I'm a part of a group called City Science that is looking at how to design new kind of communities, what we call resilient communities. And that the idea is resiliency from a variety of factors, in the sense that they can absorb shocks, that they're equitable, that they can reconfigure themselves, they're agile, and they have control over the flow of funds. I think one of the big issues in being able to address these issues is just control of financing and funding. Then unless there's a mechanism to do that, I think that a lot of this will be short-sighted. So what's happening in the US on a global basis is there's something called ESG funds. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's ESG, it means environmental, social, and governance. And there's now I think a legitimate effort. There's like $22 trillion that companies, investors have said we have to invest in projects and communities that are designed to reduce the problems around carbon, around inequity, around degradation of the climate. And so the question then is, how do we measure these things? How do we create accountability, transparency, and how do we take money out of the fossil economy and transition it into a new kind of locally sustained economy? This is where the area of tokenomics comes in. I did do a book called From Bitcoin to Burning Man and Beyond, which was just recently translated into Chinese. So I'm giving a Chinese webinar, and that it's on Sunday, which is sort of interesting. but I think we're really at a point where we're moving into a new kind of social organization. It's global, and it is fused with technology. I think the technology is changing, as I said, changing the design space. So one of the things we're doing out of MIT is we can go into a community and we can analyze. We basically have something called Cityscope, and we can identify sort of how that community works or doesn't work, and then we can say, well, how can we reduce the carbon? How can we reduce the inequity? How can we create more affordability? And how can we design a community, actually what we call nodes, to function that way? And how do we attract capital into it? So it's a much more holistic approach than one typically sees. My own view is that there have been a lot of piecemeal solutions, and now people have to have systemic solutions. And given with COVID, what's happening there, we're now seeing a real receptivity to this. So we have a project that we're doing in Seattle, where we're developing both a Black Lives Matter bond. It's a peculiar $1 billion bond to underwrite the community, where the community comes to refinance that the community will come own the assets. So we're creating a mutual organization to do that. So our approaches are pretty fundamental and systemic. I'm of the mindset that we're at the end of an era of an industrialized static system. And our concept of democracy was framed, and certainly in the US, 270 years ago for 3 million people by a small group of white landholders. And it's not scaling to where we are now. And I think we have to think of things in a global, interdependent framework. We can't just look at national boundaries. This is why there's a big interest in cities, the networks of cities as being locus of a lot of innovation. So we've done a lot of work in cities around the world. And there's more commonality of recognition of interdependency of cities than looking at even nation states. So I'll let that rest for the moment and get some trigger some conversations here.
Well, I'd like to say that as we now try to focus more specifically on how to create civil society space in a desert, so to speak. Chris, I'd like to hear, if you don't mind, a little bit more about your work, since that seems to be emblematic of what we're discussing, and the challenges and frustrations that you face, and perhaps others on the call.
Okay, I like the part of challenges and frustration. Because I started a while ago, so I was active mainly up to the 2000 or between 2000 and 2010. And after that, my experience was that the motivation went a little bit away, because in the beginning it was like, okay, I understand that the results, you cannot measure them in days or weeks or months. It's in years. And in 5 years, you were able to see an improvement. So 5 years to see societal changes for an individual is a little bit long time to wait. But after a while, those evolutions for the best changed. And after a while, I was looking at the quality of the elected persons in public institutions, and also in the laws they were passing. And actually, we weren't seeing victories from 5 to 5 years, but things getting worse and downwards. So this is about the motivation and frustration part. Of course, because it's not only me, we're a group of people, we kind of get over that. And at this moment, we're trying to involve ourselves more like helpers to other civic groups and youth groups that are still very motivated and want to change things in the communities. As about specific experiences, can I have another question?
Well, I mean, let me ask this, and John and Judy may have questions too, but what fundamentally would you like your organization to be able to bring about?
A change in mentality. We're still, the social relationships are still very human-centered, and corruption is still at a very high level. So when you interact with an institution, it's more important to have a good relationship with the persons in the institutions instead of relying on procedures. Mm-hmm. And that's not a good thing.
Mm-hmm. So that constricts, narrows advocacy initiatives and efforts.
Right.
Statewide. Yeah, and it's not the right way for a society or for a democratic society to evolve. We're still people-centered in public institutions, not on institutional procedures.
And a question: to what extent is it realistic to think that there is an opportunity to create your own kind of cooperative organizations, your own community-based organizations, which they in turn can have address some of the issues themselves and build up some capacity in the community?
Yes, I've seen that, but I have to say I'm not part of that movement right now. I have seen in the past years the local Timișoara Community Foundation evolve very, very nicely. And I'm personal acquaintance with Daniela Chesaru. Andrea for sure knows her. And I admire their work. And I also am in contact with several youth and student organizations that are very, very motivated to do something about the local community. Without any others organizational background, they started to monitor, for example, the meetings at the local council to assure more transparency and especially for the decisions related to the money. So participatory budgeting and ideas like that.
And can I add something? I mean, I feel the need to bring in the discussion a little bit of context when we are talking about civic deserts, especially in this part of Europe. And Luisa, please back me up. So we are talking, for instance, of let's take the southern part of Romania, which is mainly plain. There are plains, and the north part of Bulgaria. So it's somehow a territory that is it's the border, and it's affected by many things. For instance, the communities there were artificially planted. Some of them, they are not for like hundreds of years. They were planted by the communists, sometimes forced. You know, people were forced. Like Chris from Banat, there were a lot of people from the western part of Romania that were obliged to come and start imagine these small towns or villages in the middle of nowhere, where the winters are very harsh, and there is no good water, or it's a scarcity of water, and so on. So of course we were looking at the way the communities had or did not have time to form themselves as communities, and to have a civic community life there, a civic life there. And then it's a matter of getting to the point where now, because we've joined in 2007 European Union, as Bulgaria did, we have a migration of population from the rural areas, and especially from these communities, and people went, the young adults and the adults went to work abroad, because there are higher salaries, of course, in countries like Germany, UK, Italy, Spain, etc. And you have also this one that is adding, and then you have on the top the fact that it's aging population there, so there are less and less chances to have healthy communities. Nevertheless, it's a matter of what do you do, because we cannot, those that are involved in such projects of community mobilization, community development, civic engagement, and so on, we cannot leave these communities with no solutions, because there are solutions. And this is what we are trying to investigate: what opportunities out there, what you know, to use more brains into a project that is going to use things that we are talking today. And Luisa, please come on board and say some more about creating a context when we are talking about the civic deserts.
Sure. I'll try to zoom out a little bit further. You started by talking about the border regions. I mentioned in the beginning that this project that we're working on with civic deserts in 4 countries in Eastern Europe, interestingly, so we started by mapping these countries, and we discovered finally that the civic deserts are quite often in border regions everywhere. And this is interesting because the border regions then are either sort of neglected for historical reasons. They were either part of the Ottoman Empire, of the you know, the Soviet sphere of influence. Nothing to say about the Ottomans, but I'm just saying that there is a difference. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, as Mihai mentioned, becoming part of the European Union meant that there is going to be a very strong focus on the center and very little focus on the periphery, because everything you could find was in the center. So that's where all the brain power was, that's where all the administration was. And our countries are, I mean, I keep calling them small, even though Bulgaria is mid-sized, Romania even larger than Bulgaria. So focusing on the center and neglecting the peripheries meant that the center attracted, became a magnet city, a huge magnet city. And Romania, I think, more so than Bulgaria, does have even more magnet cities. But then what happens is that people, rather than commuting, because infrastructure is not great, they would move to those magnet cities, starting with the capital. And then what we started observing, I think, around in the past 10 years is that when you look at the electoral maps in the region, what you would see is that the capital and the other couple of large cities are maybe liberal, but everything else is, I mean, if I have to put it in American terms, I would put it in, liberal versus conservative, but they're not really conservative in here. These are more the regions or the towns or the villages where the former Communist Party is in power. Because the sort of the classical, small d Democrats and small c conservatives doesn't work this way in this day and age on the political spectrum. So what we started noticing is that the capital and the other couple of big cities are not enough to turn the tide, right? When people like the current leaders of Poland and Hungary get to power, it's not enough to work with the constituencies, and it's not enough to look at the civic power and the civic energy in the large cities. because this doesn't suffice to turn the tide. And one thing leads to the next one, takes us to look into what is going on in small cities. And the reason why we call them civic deserts is basically for two things. The one is, and I'm sorry for repeating myself for those ones who were in the conversation last time, but it's two main components. The one is a basic lack of the civic infrastructure. So the places where people would come together basically disappeared. There's no, even the pub downtown is run down. So that's the one thing. But the other thing is also, speaking of civic infrastructure, that even if there are a couple of organizations active there, community organizations or civil society organizations, their capacities are so limited that they basically cannot, cannot rally around, cannot become a focal point of civic energy. They cannot fundraise, they don't speak languages, and so on and so forth. So that's on the civic infrastructure side. And of course, this is very simplified. The other component is what I think some of you talked already about, and this is the low civic literacy. So the civic skills are lacking, the knowledge is lacking. What is actually democracy? How does it function? Why is it important that I am active? Why is this about me and not about the state or the institutions? And it's a thing that I think people have inherited from the communist periods, maybe from the time before, that basically the understanding, people feel as if they're exogenous to the state, right? So there is the state, there is the institutions, but I've got nothing to do with them. So it's a, it's a pretty complex picture. And when John was talking about, piecemeal solutions versus holistic, I think one of the things we're trying to do is to understand more about those civic deserts. What else defines a civic desert beyond those, civic infrastructure and civic literacy? Demography, the economic picture. These are some of the other components, but we try to understand a little bit more about that, so that once we have a bigger picture, we also start working on bigger solutions that are not a piecemeal approaches, as you, John said. And I think one of the biggest challenges for us really here is, how do you, when people haven't had personal experience with democracy and haven't had a positive personal experience with democracy and positive image of democracy, first of all, how do you get them to basically, especially the aging population, to stop saying, communism was great, I want to go back, make Romania, make Bulgaria great again. But when was the time that these places were great? Was it indeed pre-89? This is I think the one thing. And the second thing is, indeed, how do you create the environment for not a simulation type of, but a real positive experience of democracy right now, today, right in here. And then I think match that with the COVID situation, where we can't do anything in person anyways. So you've got a really interesting puzzle. I think we can create a computer game out of this and break your head.
Have there been any efforts in either of Romania or Bulgaria that you know of to nurture young people, to teach them about democracy and running for office, and sort of bring them along? I'm just thinking about, maybe that the older generation is not the target, because it's hard to change after so many years of habit. But younger people like you, the movers and shakers, are there any efforts to bring along younger people, to get them involved, perhaps in running for office and making changes in that way?
I will start by trying to tackle this, because it's a very good question, and there are many ways we can look at it. I mean, there were a lot of money, and we are back to a big problem, because there were a lot of money that big donors gave, starting with the donors from the 90s that were active in the 90s, like USAID, like World Learning, and so on. Till now, where the European Union is giving lots of money on things like this. The issue is that the way the funding scheme is functioning, project based. So Chris can come with more details on how hard it is to maintain the momentum that you've created through a project for longer periods of time, like years and years, because all the time you will need to find money to support, because this is a constant thing, right? To support and to invest in the young generations of people that will be involved both in politics and in civic society. So it's we are getting back to, yes, there are lots of initiatives, but as Luisa was briefly mentioning, a lot of them, they are still in big cities because it's more interesting to do it in the bigger cities than to go in a rural community, damaged and problematic community, where it's not only about talking about civic life and to promote civic education, because there are so many other things that you need to fix. On the pyramid of Maslow, this is not the main thing that these people are needing to talk about. So it's a matter of, well, yeah, there are some initiatives. How can you make them sustainable in terms of recurrency, and how do you move them from centers, geographical centers, to peripheries, geographical peripheries?
Can I just add one more aspect to that? There are two studies that I'm happy to send out to you. One is called the European Values Survey, which is basically looking at the value set of Europeans every 5 years. And it's been done since the 70s, and our region is included there, I think, since 91. And it's really interesting to see how some pretty conservative views haven't moved a millimeter since the 90s. So that's the one thing. This is also goes hand in hand with the fact that when you're coming out of a system where the ideological type of education has been in the center of the state, since '89, there's been no one to put any effort on, civic education. Civic education is not a subject in the schools in Bulgaria. I think it's a pretty new subject everywhere. Plus, the focus then always goes to the very boring stuff about, it's important stuff, but you can't win kids, over for democracy if you start explaining how the constitutional court functions. So you have to start where you have to pick them where they are to walk the walk with them to where you might think that they should be as citizens, and all of that being very normative, of course. So that's the one study that I'm very happy to share with you to look at. And there's another one that is called ICCS. This one measures the civic competences of 13-year-old ones across the world. And there are different countries in that. I think Romania, unfortunately, is not, but Bulgaria is in there. And to your question about young people, it's very interesting to see that the gap between, at least in the Bulgarian, so Bulgaria there, the civic competence of kids in Bulgaria equal those of the kids in Mexico. So there are very few who are extremely well educated, but this does not translate in any civic energy. On the contrary, the more you know and the more civically competent you are, the less you're willing to engage. And the ones who see themselves as politicians, wanting to run for office, wanting to participate, these are the ones with the, whose civic competences are pretty low down the scale. So, to your question about young people, to my highest point, of course, yeah, I think totally there is a problem of funding organizations on a project-based, project-based. However, I can imagine that also as a sector, we have learned something over the years, and there are ways to bridge the project-based work, because obviously there are only very few funders out there who would want to support your work in a different in a different manner. And this is also, I mean, so much relates to the way transition to democracy was approached back in the 90s, including the idea that you replicate all the models that are existing somewhere else, that have been functioning somewhere else, and you just replicate also including the way civil society functions. And a lot of donors made very negative experience in the 90s, where organizations basically popped up just like mushrooms, used a lot of the funds for sheer existence, but didn't really add up any value to creating any civic environment. And I think we've moved beyond that phase, but those problems exist. And as Christy was saying earlier in this conversation, so the institutions, they're somewhere down here. What really counts is people's relationships. And maybe there is a way to, maybe there's something positive about that. I'm not sure, because I also don't think that this is going to disappear anytime soon. So I think that the question here is also how to use the positive sort of energy in those personal relationships to overcome deficiencies.
Mm-hmm. So, John, I would want to ask you if you've managed to get in such communities, or what are your thoughts if we consider all these contacts that we've tried to create, which is not exhaustive, but it's pretty. I mean, it gives a clue on what we are dealing with.
No, this is very helpful. I think I mean, what I'm struck by is the extent to which there can be what went through my mind when you were discussing the situation there and the importance of relationships, the extent to which there can be sort of natural indigenous organizations that are voluntary, that people have some sense of efficacy and control over, and to what extent you can start to build on those. I think if you try to import something from another culture, it doesn't work, it doesn't take. But if there's things that you can build, this is the whole grassroots, that people feel that they can do something, they have consequence, they can take control over things, they can shape their community, and they have the resources to do that. I think that is sort of where one has to begin. I mean, Judy was saying, well, you can have youth to run for office, but if there are things, if they're running for office in a system that's rigged against them, and they're working in a system that is very is self-ineffective, but they can perhaps start to do their own organizations, develop their own sense of efficacy. I mean, people talk about startups and things like that, and but there is a whole question of how do you get control over resources? How do people feel that they have the agency to do something? I think that when you have a very authoritarian society, the government takes care of you, you don't have any agency, you defer to that. And I think the ability to create a sense of agency and outcome is really an important starting point. And are there examples of that? Is that something that's there, or can be built upon, or is that something very different?
I would say that there are very few examples, unless you know where to look, but they start at the family level. For example, the Romanian American Foundation has been trying, I think, for the past 10 or maybe more years to sponsor cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives.
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
Yes, and out of 200 that they initially supported in the forming phases, 2 are still existing today. Oh. After funds and support and capacity building and everything. And the reason for that, the often quoted reason, is lack of trust in pooling resources, and trusting that by pooling resources together, you get better outcomes than what you would by working on your own. And that's been actually economically proven, and everyone there knows it. I mean, they know they get better deals, better yields, better systems, better efficiency if they work together, and still they don't, because there's this issue of mistrust and, the legacy that everyone mentioned. but I'm wondering whether we have to be more creative and look at other forms of association that maybe are at a much smaller scale, that can transcend the family level, because it seems that we're still in feudalism in terms of how much do we trust our neighbor. And also there are big cultural differences within the country as well, in terms of regional differences, historical legacies that also prove the point that in some regions association is easier because there's the perception that they had some, shared institutional, cultural, so some shared trust that happened way back when in history. So it's messy, and I was also wondering about that, like scenarios where you can engineer a sort of experiment on pooling resources that demands very little of the people participating, and that can return high yields immediately to sort of get them on board.
Some of you probably know American history well enough to know that when de Tocqueville came to the U.S. 200 years ago, he noted that the most impressive thing he found were all these civic organizations. And it's fairly easy to start them here around particular issues, both at a national level, at a state level, and at a local level. And in fact, I would argue that once we get rid of the crazy man who is our president at this time, that one of the things that will have kept him from doing far more damage than he's done are the civic organizations, advocacy groups that have blocked him in so many ways. So it's sort of hard for John and Judy and me to hear what you're up against when we're in a country where it's much easier to start these organizations. I've done several of them myself over the years. Some of not all of which still exist, but most of them still exist, and led to groups like the National Children's Defense Fund, which advocates on behalf of children, and so on. If I may, I'm being too much the retired academic, but I wanted to share several thoughts. I'll do it in 3 to 5 minutes. But one is that there are 4 ways of looking at the development of organizations, whether on the local level or state or regional level and on a national level. Sort of 4 categories. And one is social organizations that serve particular populations or vulnerable groups, having to do with health or agriculture or the elderly, that sort of thing, but with a social focus. Another type of civic organization addresses entrepreneurism and business development, entrepreneurial networking. And then the other 2 would be groups that focus on education and one on environmental issues. Now, these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but in the literature here and in the way that civic organizations are discussed in the US and even by the Eurasia Foundation, these are the ways that we usually tend to categorize them. Getting going and maintaining your clout, however, has to do with how to build legitimacy of organizations. And the Carnegie Endowment is particularly good if you want to look at their website on this. But there are several arguments about or points about maintaining legitimacy. And that is that one is that organizations need to be led internally in terms of membership and activism internally and not by outside elites. In the US, you can have outside elites doing things, but in a country like yours, and particularly in the outlying areas and so on, if you try to put together organizations, it's not going to be one of you moving somewhere and telling people what to do or how to run it. A second one, besides the internally led, is that the issues that are selected need to directly appeal to or impact the lives of the local people. In other words, they have to be seen as, this concerns me. Somebody's not asking me to come to their picnic. This is my picnic and these are my issues. A third is how do they function? In other words, it needs to be downward accountability, transparency, political independence. Particularly, in countries like yours in the region where there's still such paranoia left over from the days of communism and people working for the state as secret agents and so on. Final two, one was who do you work with? In other words, how do you bridge social divides, which you've also talked about, because you say that there are these regional differences and divides. And then finally, is the importance of doing something to assess impact of your work, whether it's research traditional or in some other way, just surveys, demonstrating to people that their efforts that they've been involved in is having some impact on their lives and improving things that they want improved in their lives, either nationally or state or locally. So with that in mind, it seems to me that a key concern or issue has to do with those of you who want to address this civic desert. Do you try to do it by building, is your strategy to build small organizations in different places in the country, or to build 1 or 2 or 3 national organizations that address the whole country, the status of something in the entire country? And whether you decide to take on the state itself in terms of state policies, or whether you focus on something that's less confrontational with the state. I won't go into the things that I've experienced before, but these come from my experiences here in this country, and I'm not sure how relevant what I've said is to your country, your situation. But this is how I sort of look at in preparing for this meeting today, sort of how I look at what you're up against and some of the thoughts that I would offer for your consideration.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Larry.
This is very, yeah, should I go first? So this program that I talked about in the very beginning, what it does is it basically looks for one strong organization per civic desert in the countries that I listed at the beginning, so Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, and Romania, and together with them develops a capacity building program for very small, locally rooted organizations that work with means of civic education, civic participation. That's what it does. So this speaks a lot to what you were saying, rather than sort of trying to, I don't know, implant or sort of register new organizations. It basically looks for those who already exist and tries to empower them. So this speaks a little bit to your point. Identify to what you quoted by the research of the Carnegie Endowment. So in a way, yes, that's one of the things that we're trying to do. Identifying those who are already active at the local level and seeing what are ways to basically support them. The other, you started your presentation by talking about the 4 different types of civic organizations. A couple of years ago, when we did some mapping in the region here, before we started doing this program that is called Civic Europe, by the way, we mapped what is happening outside of the capitals and the big cities in terms of civil society organizations that specifically work with means of civic education, civic participation. So basically try to see who are the liberals out there outside of big cities. And we encountered a lot of organizations who do social services. And I'm not sure what the situation is like in Romania, but at least in Bulgaria, they have a very different relationship to the state's agencies and to municipalities. So they basically become service providers, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but they become almost like a company that works with the municipality to fill in the gaps. And this, in the Bulgarian case at least, after the mapping we did some 80 interviews here in Bulgaria. It's really not a big country. We discovered only 2 organizations that still adhere to their mission that goes beyond delivering social services. almost on a contractual transactional relationship with the authorities. And then social enterprise or enterprise and business development, this is a very boutique thing. This is a very niche thing that again focuses on either those who are in the capital or maybe in one of the other two larger cities, at least in the Bulgarian case. So everyone else, this is not relevant to them. And you spoke also about the organizations that deal with environmental issues. I'm not sure if you've heard about the so-called Green Deal that the European Commission is working on, which was very, very popular in the news before COVID-19 arrived. And I have to say that this was no news in a country like Bulgaria, even though we're part of the European Union. Because here, what happens is that the capital is the city in Europe with the worst quality of air, so the highest level of air pollution, simply because the poorer neighborhoods of Sofia are burning whatever they get in order to heat in the winter. So you have to, the discrepancy between, all my neighbors who are hipsters, because I happen to live in a hipster neighborhood in Sofia, who care about, zero waste and whatever else, and the hoods that are 10 kilometers away from downtown Sofia, where people burn whatever they get to basically just get basic heating in the winter, is so big. That this conversation, it's as Mihai was saying, the Maslow pyramid. So where do you start? So that if you have a claim of understanding something a little bit better than those where you're trying to do your interventions, how do you find the language? How do you, we all come with our big hearts and we all care about all the things we do, but at the end of the day, the discrepancies sometimes are just so big. Yeah.
Wow.
We're getting lost.
If I can just jump in, Luisa, because we had a similar conversation recently about Romania, Bucharest being the pollutest capital in Europe. And really the same reason was given, which turned out to be quite superficial / racist argument. It's mostly because in Bucharest there are illegal businesses that are burning imported garbage that's polluting the air. But then the overall image is easier to just point it to the people who cannot defend themselves. So this was, it hit me quite strong now when you said it, because, oh, this was our way of saying it. And now people are actually digging in, but the authorities in Bucharest are not helping, of course, because of personal reasons. But going back to the question about how we are trying to do some things, as I'm working with public libraries, and now I'm part of the NGO, what we are trying to build is actually local partners for NGOs. So when the NGOs will think about taking public libraries as partners, because they don't think to do that, even though they're implementing projects at the community level, and the public library should be an institution that, could support and provide sustainability for any kind of educational efforts in any direction. We want librarians to be prepared to actually understand their position, and the way we do it is by implementing innovative library services in Romanian context in hundreds of libraries actually, and most of the libraries are rural libraries. So that's why when I said I kind of, at the community level, when librarians are trained and they're ready to implement, actually good projects can be implemented very effectively and provide sustainable solutions for that community. But just because we consider public institutions as old and outdated and bureaucratic, and public libraries are public institutions, and yes, some librarians are wives of mayors, it happens, then we actually throw everything away with the which can be a potential resource. And we started with projects that, you know, more cultural, because in our region, libraries, public libraries are cultural institutions. And then now we are actually doing the most innovative one is libraries are hosting programming clubs for children from rural communities, and the kids are doing great. They are just, you know, over what we thought their level would be just by coming to the library regularly and working as a team. And now we're starting to do also helping librarians see libraries as educational hubs that are not just related to schools, but also civic literacy that Luisa mentioned earlier. But this process also involves educating librarians, because most of them have not been educating in this. They don't share the values, the democratic values. And when they start to see, you know, the benefits, that they do it all the time. Like in our programming clubs, the librarians are teaching to do their own rules, in how to vote on what rules to have in their programming club. And that's a process. I mean, it's in 5 years, you get from not knowing how to vote to actually doing that in a rural library in Romania. And now it's also happening in Moldova. There are very good civic projects happening in rural Moldova due to libraries. But I've talked with a number of NGOs in Moldova, and they don't consider public libraries as partners. So it's a process here that we actually need to put people from the same community together, which is painful. And I'm sure people working with Fundații Comunitare know this. Like, I don't have to call from Bucharest to put in connection Andreea with the library in Galați. Like, I should not be doing this. You know, the things should just click somehow and people should find each other. But just because of this bureaucracy mess and also personal relations and lack of trust, sometimes we have to do it.
Well, what you just said, I find, excuse me, I find very exciting for this reason. I mean, some of it's what you're talking about, of course, is what Mahica does with EduCab. But what I find exciting is a great opportunity for you to build on this and have more success are the following things. Number one, there seem to be many libraries in Romania, in Moldova, whatever.
The region, there's a legacy of the communist regime in the region. The same in Bulgaria. In Bulgaria, they used to have actually 2 network of public libraries, the Chitaliște and then the public libraries. So yeah.
So therefore, you have a lot of institutions. Secondly, the institutions, the libraries, even though they're not being fully utilized by civic organizations, they are not, I would imagine that they are non-threatening institutions. In other words, the authorities and others don't see them as threatening. And so if you then can use these 2 things together to promote the kind of thing that you're doing and think in more creative ways, and to get libraries to engage in seditious activities, to change the culture, you know, to change the way people think, to change, you know, preparing youth for leadership, for example, or, you know, whatever it may be, having libraries sponsor these sorts of things and getting these librarians turned on by, you know, enough to do it, which will take education over time. I find what you just said, at least for me, to be the most exciting thing to come out of this discussion, and that is that to use this institution and forum as a means to do the kind of things that you're suggesting you are doing and want to do more of.
Yeah, I want to, I mean, the discussion, I mean, it's getting into actually the middle, we are getting in the middle of communities. So if we look at small communities and we are then going to small communities in in these civic deserts, then we find the mayor office, we find maybe a library which is active or not. We might find well, for sure we'll find a school, or in the nearby village is a school that now gets all the children together from like several villages, because there are not so many children anymore in those rural areas. So they get one school in one village, let's say. And then you have more or less a broken community. And by saying that, I'm considering, you know, the fact that you don't have the social mixture in there. You have some kids and some elder persons there, and that's pretty much it. And as Luisa, you were mentioning in the chat, it's a lot of pressure, for instance, on institutions like libraries, because they depend on they are dependent on the money from the mayor's office, usually from the local authority. But what I wanted to bring in the discussion is that in the approach that we have, and Claudia and I, we had a lot of conversations since we are together in EduCab, but also the discussion was also with Luisa, Alexandra, and with you, Judy, and Larry, is that maybe one solution out there is to tackle democracy by not talking about democracy directly, but by talking about what makes a community work. And the reason why I'm saying that, saying this, is that usually people don't understand what the hell are we talking about in this discussion. I mean, if this conversation would be heard not in rural Romania, in some rural Kentucky village, they will not understand a thing, because we are talking about things that they cannot relate to. So I was so interested in the work that you, John, you know, part of the work you are doing is on, you know, self-organizing systems, decentralized and so on. And I was like, but what about if we can enter into some communities whereby we build on this historic way of people being together, because people tended in rural communities to help each other by default. And I think we can build on that, even if it's maybe a distance in between, but this is not a civic, well, it might be a civic behavior to help the neighbor to build her house and so on. So what are your thoughts in this?
Oh, I think that's very much the focus. I mean, and it's no joke when people talk about, you know, the whole Burning Man, it has a certain reputation, but part of the idea is that, you know, you're getting, there's a whole set of principles there around self-organization and mutual aid and respecting that, and how can you create community. There you have 70,000 people in 2 weeks create a sense of community and generate art. And it's an exploration of how you do that. What are the sort of the minimum set of assumptions that allow people to come together and actually create community, create value together? And I think that's intrinsic in people. I think there's some initial conditions that you try to achieve, and I couldn't agree with you more. Rather than talk about democracy as an abstraction, I think is give people a sense of agency, efficacy, and out of that to develop trust upon one another. And let that happen organically in the different communities, and try to seed situations where that can succeed. So I think that is a rather than sort of a top-down approach, it is a very sort of distributed bottom-up. And what are the sort of initial conditions that allow that to happen? And I think you're seeing that on a global scale. I mean, that's what's interesting to me about Burning Man. It's not. Is that there are all these movements whereby people come together for a period of time, create a sense of community, create value together, and then go back into communities and apply those ideas. So yeah, I think that is an appropriate focus.
Chris, we're all very happy to meet your wife.
Yeah, good choice.
So
what about funding? What is particularly some of the European and US foundations are they that ought to be, you know, I'm thinking of what's Soros and so on. Is he big in terms of funding in the region?
Not at all.
He is big in terms of propaganda. That's what I can tell you for sure, because there is a particular agenda that is very much fueled on the idea that Soros, narcissistic NGOs will take over and will somehow lead to us not having national autonomy and stuff like that. So it's big in terms of propaganda. I couldn't really say in terms of funds. Yeah,
but it was for a while very present in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I mean, the rhetoric around Soros, I mean, it's everywhere. Even Donald Trump was using it because he's one of the, well, with his Open Societies Foundation, is one of the promoters of the Open Society, and is like putting a lot of money into those organizations that are fighting dictators and wannabe dictators. So it's normal to have such rhetoric in more authoritarian countries, or you know, those parties that want to build more authoritarian you know, governments and so on. But it was present. I mean, there are some money out there. The thing is that when you talk about small communities, it's the issue of penetrating because everything is controlled in this who said it? Alexander, I think, in this feudal kind of way, is the resources are controlled by the mayor. The mayor usually it's part of a political party, so it's a matter of, okay, even if there are funds out there, how can you get them in such small communities, and how can you maintain the flow of money?
Can I make a point? I this principle, I think, is very important for these things to be self-funding. I think that the turning to foundations and other, I think that inadvertently there's created dependency and an influence, and the fact that you can actually, they can generate, retain their own value in the community is sort of really important. And so it's disturbing to hear that, say, agricultural cooperatives can't work. But if there are other kinds of entities that they can do them on their own, they're voluntary, maybe it's small, but that gives them the autonomy, and then it allows them to build their own trust within their organizations. And you know, not to get into the tech, but there's a lot of stuff that tech can do to create transparency and accountability, and actually, I mean, properly done, reinforce certain kinds of trust. But I think that is a really important thing. And I guess what I'm looking for are certain examples of sort of indigenous natural grassroots organizations that themselves spontaneously can form, or is there still a dependency on some outside authority to provide funding and therefore create that dependency? When you talk about the mayor's
Claudia's situation is a good example of not necessarily needing to go for outside funding, because these libraries currently exist. And
but they're still controlled by the mayors. And so, I mean, I was just trying to understand the extent to which they're really independent. They can have their own, do their own thing, generate their own funding, and or voluntarily fund and then reinforce themselves.
But I would guess that even if they're controlled by mayors, that if Claudia is able to work with librarians to do certain things that look like civic pluses for the mayors, that they won't necessarily understand that it has meaning and agency or impact beyond that. But John, you're also talking about, I take it, local initiative, farmers.
Yeah, the local initiatives or guilds and things like that, where ranges and guilds where they get together and they have some kind of the local control.
So there are in Romania this kind of structures, and also GALs, also structures. GAL, do you know, Mihai?
Yes, of course. This is a group of local initiative. Group de
Acțiune locală.
Group of local action.
So you do have this, but what I think they're lacking, at least from what I saw, it's the democratic values being at their core.
Oh.
I mean,
and also the fact that they are not very, very spread. You know, it looks like these type of initiatives are not finding the right formula to spread. And the question about who's giving the funds, I think is very, very important, because I heard Luisa at a certain point saying that they did some mapping in terms of like civic, the civic map of things. And I can totally agree with this radiography that you did, that there are many social NGOs providing social services or special education services, especially in the poor parts of Romania. And this type of NGOs are very much dependent on the local administration funds and state funds. So they are not really empowered to have a civic power or a civic voice.
Right.
And by that I mean some type of an opposition type of voice.
Right.
I'm talking about autonomy. And then I heard Ms. Hai, who said that maybe we should find a way in which we shouldn't teach democracy and civic abilities by talking about them. So I was wondering, how can we actually create this type of venues in which children and people in general wouldn't be taught democracy by talking, but by interacting in some healthy democratic way. And we don't really have the type of entities and institutions to provide that, because everybody is somehow dependent to this state type of
holding to the state.
funding. The libraries, the NGOs, the educational institutions. So
I have a question about that, about other contexts. So in a way, it sounds like a pity party, right? So we made the perfect case of how we're all hopeless. And I'm wondering how we ourselves can like maybe position ourselves in an imagination scenario based on other practices where everyone has a legacy, an institutional legacy, a culture, everything. But how can you kickstart, or how can you land, how can you grow, how can you implant a different model? So in these experiments on decentralized organizations that have resources from somewhere, they don't necessarily divert resources from the state, I'm guessing. How can it start? How would not a formula, but how does it look like when you start something that has a different model that is not based on a dependency, on a historical dependency?
Just I really like to reinforce that. One of the things that comes from is the arts. I mean, if you really, some of the artists and artist groups actually reframe a whole, the reality of what is possible, and doing it in the context of art then translates into different kinds of participation. And that was certainly true in a lot of examples of what you're seeing, not just in the US and Europe, but it comes through the artistic community, actually challenging different norms, creating different forms, different metaphors, and then making it acceptable for people. And it comes through music, comes through arts, and then the karmas comes out of that, and then you build a new kind of legacy out of it. I think the arts play a very big role in this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. But then again, arts are quite posh and quite deluxe products that you will not see in the very Moldavian
It doesn't
art.
have to be a deluxe. I mean, the art can be very guerrilla art. I mean, it's street art. It's really, yeah. I mean, the art is actually making do, is giving a voice to a whole different kind of community, giving legitimacy to that voice, that people can identify with it, and creates a language that people can interact.
But
so
if you did, you probably wouldn't want to call it guerrilla art.
Why not?
Why not?
Oh yeah, but I can see why. Yeah, but we can do some guerrilla art, just not name it like that. So yeah.
Here in the Boston area, and not just Boston, but some other cities, there are children's choirs. The Boston Children's Chorus is one that Judy was involved with at its inception, but it brings kids at various ages. The Boston Children's Chorus actually has about 10 different choirs, and they perform. And but it's a very seditious thing, because what this is really about, it's an initiative that's, it's art, it's singing, and people love to hear these children singing, but it's also about agency and social justice in a lot of these so-called minority children who are learning that they can have some power. And so the teachers and the choral directors and so on see it as a way to, you know, transform the lives of some of these children in terms of their aspirations and capabilities. So I just want to underscore that as an example of what John's talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would add to what you already said in terms of art, and I would definitely agree with that. The creative forward way of doing things will definitely work. And I've also seen some initiatives that have some, let's take EduCub, for example. They seem to be on that forward way type of thinking. So they are small, they are creative, and they are a bit subversive because they don't really say what they are doing.
Yeah.
No, that's right. Right.
Yeah, so, but the problem with small is that sometimes it's difficult, or it's quite rare to find the right abilities at the operational level for things to grow, actually. And when they grow, they might be seen as a bit of a threat.
Yeah, but by that time, the thing is that by that time, when it becomes it becomes a threat, you cannot stop it. I mean, this is because this is what we are trying to do in EduCab. I mean, that's why we are planting. We are trying to create a context whereby the libraries to rethink the way they are functioning, because there are institutions that are already there. Of course, at this moment, they are dependent on the resources from the mayor's office. But if we decentralize the way these institutions are getting additional resources, and this is what we are trying to do and to build through EduCab, whereby it's using fractions of resources from various companies, informal groups, NGOs, other public institutions, individuals that would contribute to that particular library in that particular village, let's say, or a small community. And then the librarian, hopefully she or he, usually it's a she, will get more courage. Because now, let's say, 60% of the resources are channeled through other partners and groups of supporters and so on. And the thing is that by the time the mayor is realizing that it's not a neutral thing to get people used to diversity of information, of this and that, it's too late, because the parents are already in not in need, but they see the value of having such a institution.
They took it another way. You actually changed the framework to how people look at it.
Yeah, but
if I could take a minute, I just went in and asked our daughter.
No, you can't.
Well, it's not me. I'm going to ask our daughter to take my seat. Her name is Ariel. She has Judy's last name, Ariel Garfinkel, and she's 31 years old. I wanted her to tell you about the organization she worked with. It's a national organization with chapters all over the country called Girls Inc. And I wanted her to tell you particularly how they use volunteers in seditious ways to work with young women.
Oh, thank you so much, Ariel. We could not stand Larry anymore. I mean, really.
Yeah, I know. It's so much better now, huh? Hi, everybody. So I'm Judy and Larry's daughter, Ariel, and I know Mehetza for several years now. But yeah, so to give you a sense of what I'm doing in my work at Girls Inc., or Girls Incorporated is the full name, but it's a national advocacy organization that focuses on advocacy for girls and young women. So from young girls in elementary school up through older girls heading off to university, so through high school. And one of the programs in particular that I oversee pertains to college access, so preparing high school girls to understand or these are often girls that are first generation college students. So it's to help equip them with knowledge and resources and skills to be prepared to apply to college, enter college, and succeed in college. And both in that college readiness program, but also across the organization at large, we really rely on our volunteer base. And the volunteers themselves represent a whole mix of people. So some of them are people with good hearts, politically engaged, socially engaged people who want to do something, spend their time meaningfully, in addition to whatever work they may be doing themselves. Others are people who have been involved in the organization in different capacities, like donors, or maybe even some people who have graduated from the program themselves. But it's really neat because they're able to bring in their own experiences and their own knowledge. Oh, including some I forgot to mention who themselves work at universities. So it's just a really neat mix of people with all these different backgrounds and experiences and knowledge bases that are with one common goal of helping equip girls with access, in this case, to college. But it can be applied, I think, even outside of the specific realm of college access work. But yeah, so that I'll leave it there because I'm not sure how the
the reason I ask you to tell them this is that there are people in every community, in Romania, Bulgaria, everywhere, who are progressive enough that they would want to work with and volunteer to work with girls or boys or whatever, so that you have the makings there of a non-budget matter. That is, you don't have to raise money for this. These are people who are volunteering, who can organize educational programs for kids as a service or as advocacy or whatever.
Mentoring.
For mentoring, yeah. And so you could create and tap into networks and build them across the country, where, like Girls Inc. is here, where they're all locally based, but with an overall national focus for particular purposes.
Yeah. Well, you know, one challenge when anyone goes and tries to do things in small communities is that, especially in broken communities, whereby, as we talked, you have only maybe some kids and some elderly, senior persons, is that you might not be able to have continuity if you build capacity at local level. And that's the idea, right? To have people take control of their destinies and lives and of their communities, and you as an external person to maybe be just a facilitator in the beginning, or as we say, we try to be friends with the people that we meet. And that's a key performance indicator for us in EduCab. It's the quality of friendships that we make, not the number of projects we are developing in various communities. But then what do you do? Because these people at a certain moment go away, right? So the problem is that and it's a problem. It's that people, since there is no economic life or very little economic life in such communities, they will go to centers, to bigger communities. So it's sometimes it might be the Sisyphus, you know, the legend whereby he was like carrying the rock on the hill and going down. So it's a matter of doing the same over and over again in such communities, preparing maybe good citizens or great professionals, but not for the community that you are interested in. What I don't know, experiences you have whereby this did not happen, or there were solutions to that?
I have to apologize. I have to get on another call in a few minutes, so I apologize for that. But
okay, can you stay another like 5 minutes, John, with us?
About 5 minutes, but I'm on another call. Yes,
5 minutes. And one before you go, I mean, I wanted to ask you if you see other people that you'll see fit for such a conversation, because I feel that some of us here in this discussion would want to continue it, and maybe you can join. Maybe you can also have some other people that you can recommend, because it's not only, I mean, it's the trigger talking about Central and Eastern Europe, but this is a huge issue, and it's an assault towards democracies all over the place.
Sure.
I mean, from Switzerland to big cities in US, or look, Hong Kong, right? So anyway, if you have some thoughts on this, John, before you leave, and thank you so much for being with us. And
well, certainly, no, it's really great to be part of this conversation. I think these are really, fundamental questions, and the question that each area has its own challenges and legacies, and that's what I was trying to understand here. But I'll need to get some thought about where you see some ability to mobilize spontaneous grassroots efforts that then lead to democratic norms, that then lead to certain people being able to form institutions or organizations that function that way. I think it's, from what I hear you saying, is that there's such a legacy from the past that there isn't the trust, there's a deference to, quote, authorities, that it's very difficult to have in natural democratic processes unfold. That's what I'm hearing. So the question is how do you able to stimulate that? And I do think that art is a prerequisite to that. I mean, that because it changes the framework. It makes it play. It doesn't make it political. It allows people to think about things they otherwise wouldn't, and then come together and then do things, and then those become translated into more action-oriented institutional activities. But I think art plays a really important role in this, believe it or not.
Mahitza, I'd like to make a suggestion.
Please.
I'd certainly be interested in a follow-up conversation to this. And John is so busy that I will offer him to come back as a favor to him.
Sure.
There's also a woman, Judy White, who lives in Washington, who used to work for the National Endowment for the Arts, and for 20 or 30 years has used arts in an advocacy way in communities across the country. I'd like to invite her to be on. And I would suggest, just my suggestion, you guys can change it if you want to, but I would suggest that our next discussion really be focused on specific ideas of things that could be done, like Claudia's mentioned and others.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Let's come up with 10 or 15 different things that you guys and your colleagues could consider to use in a seditious way to change the culture there, and the political culture in particular.
That's actually great. I mean, let's do this, and we can circulate within this group some, we can send some emails to see when we can all can do it. But I would suggest to be like maybe next week, if it's okay, because in this way it's still warm, the subject, and we can still relate to it. John, what do you think? Are you free next
try to
week?
do that. Yes. Okay.
Okay. Excellent, John.
But only if this time we can see Alexandra, not just a photo.
No, Alexandra, we should see you now.
I'm so sorry. I will be on my laptop next time.
Okay. Bye-bye. We have to run.
Thank
you
you
so
for
much, John.
joining us.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Excellent. So anyway, so it's we are 1 hour and 38 minutes from the beginning of the conversation. If we can stay another 10 minutes to make the transition to the end, and then when should we have this discussion? When are you free?
Why don't you just put out a couple of suggested times and let people respond?
Okay, but for instance, for you, Judy and Larry, 11 your time is good as a starting hour?
I mean, whatever.
Yeah, okay, cool.
We're here.
Excellent.
We're here on our farm with our goats and pigs and chickens.
Exactly.
And daughter.
Can I just ask a logistic logistical question. There are some things that PDFs and presentations that people have been posting in the chat. After this call is over, how do I access those? Because I'd like to look at them.
You can download it now. You see it appears, and this is the best way. Another way is to send an email, follow-up email to everybody, and then whoever posted something to repost it.
Okay. All right.
If you could do that, Mihail, I can help. That would be great, because I was kicked out of the conversation with bad connection, and every time you lose the chat history. So it would be great.
I did that. It
Perfect.
was not
Thank you.
voluntarily. I kicked you out.
I knew it.
So Larry, should we invite also the person that you've mentioned in the next call?
Well, it depends on whether or not you folks would be interested, but she's I've known her. In fact, years ago I hired her to work with me when I set up one of my organizations.
Then no. If you've worked with her.
She knows this sort of thing from the grassroots up, which I think could be really good. That is, how to use the arts in a grassroots manner as a means of social change.
This is actually very, very good. I mean, this is in line, as you know, through EduCap. This is what we try to do, is to create this ecosystem of knowledge in small communities, whereby we use these neutral tools like culture, arts, and so on to like a glue for the community. So any examples of such institutions that were developing such and working with such methodologies, I mean, is really good. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, perhaps I would like to stick around for a bit with whoever is available to consider how even these conversations that we generate here can reach more places, because this is a resource in itself. I mean, not as necessarily always giving the context, because everybody knows it, or so we think, but rather the paths for other possibilities, paths for potential. And I'm thinking maybe we can make a practice from these calls to share the resources, or maybe collect them on like a resource page or something like that, because I think this is a conversation that people can tap into in different times. Maybe not everyone during the call, but it's as if we're building a library of examples and contexts, and I think that's very valuable, and I would love to find a way to store them somehow and to share them.
Great idea. Oh.
It is a good idea. We should think about that. One of the challenges, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, is that sometimes it becomes very hard to maintain, and it's
it's
have
true.
hundreds of it. Then if it's how do you? Well, Claudia can help us, because she's with the librarian training. Sorry, no problem.
We can figure out a way. I'd volunteer for that, to figure out a way.
Nice.
Excellent.
I agree with Alexandra, because there are at least a couple of institutions, organizations that would have really enriched the conversation. I'm thinking about the question about the youth. Noi Orizonturi, Fundația Noi Orizonturi is doing exactly this in Romania. They are doing youth clubs where they don't teach democracy, as it's not in their curricula, but the values that they put in their activities with youth are very democratic. And they have been doing this and also exporting the methodology in other countries as well. So, and Ashoka as well, I think it's, they're part of this changing and bringing entrepreneurial spirit in the civic society. And I just want to, because the idea of librarians being tied up with the mayors and the mayors forcing them to do stuff, I really hate that. I just want to share with you the story of a librarian who was fired by a mayor, and they closed the library, and then she actually sued the office, and then after he lost the position of the mayor, she actually won, and they have to hire her again. And now she's working with a third mayor since that mayor, and she's doing innovative projects. She's doing civic education for youth in her community. And this is a regular rural librarian from Romania. And if she can do it, then come on, people, come on, we can do it as well.
That's a great example. I think for one of our next meetings, one of the things that I can offer is to basically present to you in a little bit more in-depth how exactly these capacity building programs look like for the countries that are part of the program Civic Europe, and specifically the one in Bulgaria, where we've already done a program for some 20 individuals that come from different places across the country. And this is based on all the research we were able to do in the past couple of years, but also the work on the ground we've been doing to figure out what would bring, I guess, the highest added value.
Excellent. And Luisa, I mean, one thought, it might be good if you can send something prior to the discussion. In this way, whoever has time and can read it beforehand.
Sure.
And in this way, and also Larry, it might be good if we invite the person that you told us about to introduce her a little bit in the subject. In this way, we can focus, as you said, I mean, we want to go as specific as we can, and we love, and this was the discussion that I had with Luisa, is a matter of getting to solutions. Once we know the context a little bit, but we don't need to know all the details about the context, because sometimes it's actually better to not to be biased. Okay, it was this and that, but focus on solutions. And of course, these, once they are taken by someone, they will be adapted and we'll see what can be implemented from that. But we also like the idea of having the next discussion very, very applied.
Okay, good.
Great.
Thanks for including us. It's really exciting to talk to you guys, all of you. This is wonderful.
Thank you all for taking the time.
Our pleasure.
Thank you so much. So last thoughts from everybody, like 20 seconds, please. And Gruya, including you. Gruya, it's a dear friend of ours, and he could join us for the last part of the discussion. We are closing it with some final thoughts.
Actually, I wrote my final thought. I think we just need to clone that amazing librarian. That would definitely solve it for everybody. And I made it. Maybe, I mean, can we just find a formula to empower and find this type of people? Just multiply them in a way, and the spirit of it.
Join EduCab.
I think I already do.
We don't have EduCab in Galați, right, Mihai?
My only final
now, Andrea.
My only final suggestion is that we elect a new chair for this meeting. Got you.
Better watch out, he'll mute you.
So we are volunteering Larry and
no, you're not. No, you're not.
This is such a bunch of rebels. I love everybody. That's a sign that I'm in the right tribe, like in the right place.
Thank you. So Claudia, Nikolai, Chris, and who else? Alexandra, final thoughts.
Yeah.
Stop being shy.
Okay.
No, for me, it's something that's building on what Andrea said. Is it's not just cloning, but really learning from people who actually did some things before, because they did it in a more in a harder condition than we are doing it now, and it involves a lot of patience. And I think this is something that I need to work on.
So I've been trying to think for the past 15 minutes how to intervene, but mayors are actually quite concerned about their cities, and now we have new mayors all across Bulgaria. And if we'll tell them, okay, guys and gals, you have to work for the future of the cities actually, and for the teachers and the education, because currently the whole system is lacking teachers, and there will be so many this year. 10,000 teachers are being retired, and this is the biggest problem actually in education in Bulgaria. So for me, have to find the new teachers and support them, and this is our whole campaign. That's why I did the movie. But I believe that if we find those new guys and gals as teachers and teach them civic education, we got a done deal.
Thank you. Chris.
Yes, I'm looking forward for the next meeting because we have a very concrete and specific task at hand.
Yep, thank you. Alexandra.
I'm thinking find the others. I'm thinking that we keep referencing each other's work, and I guess there's more of us out there, and maybe we should connect to all these librarians and to be their support system, and sort of just keep enlarging this, you know, thinking and acting support ecosystem. And that part of that is just indexing our conversations and, you know, throwing them out on the internet. I think part of it.
Excellent.
I'm really happy about this. Thank you so much.
And Luisa, you have the final word.
I'll give it to you though, the final word. But I'll still make use of my time. What you say, do I have another half an hour? No, the joke is like, I'm very grateful to, first of all, be hi to you for, you know, taking the lead on that, for always being, I don't know, for pushing all of us to go beyond our civic energy. So I'm really grateful for taking the initiative on the series of conversations, to providing also space to talk about civic deserts and to try to understand a little bit better and unpack all of that. And also to the brain powers of everyone else who's in this conversation, especially to Judy and Larry, because it's you know, it's a different time zone. You don't have to care about the things we care about over here. So I know things are usually they're closer to one's heart when they're geographically closer to us. So it's really, I really appreciate it. And it's great to be, I was just texting privately Alexandra to say, I think I will very soon start learning Romanian, because I feel weird not speaking Romanian. So yeah, thank you very much. I really look forward to the next conversation as well. And I'm happy to share more and to basically give this program that we're working on is something to dissect and to see what are we doing now and what can we do better, differently. But also start to look at it a little bit more from the point of view of the whole ecosystem, to really understand a little bit better what are these civic deserts and what are different things we can do there. So really look forward to seeing you all in a week's time, and then maybe we can all grab a drink then, because it's wine time here.
Yeah, and actually, Judy and Larry are from Brasov. They are from Romania. They just speak weird English. Well, thank you so much. I mean, I'm so humbled that you could all be here. You know that each of you, you do a lot of things. I'm so sorry that we don't have time to speak more. We can have like hours and hours talking about each of you doing incredible things. And you know, sometimes the fact that we are working in small communities or in some areas where there are not so many other actors, we might feel alone. but that's the idea of investing time also in such discussions, in connecting one to each other, and to realize that we are not alone. We are actually very powerful if we stick together, because that's the idea, and to share things that we know, ideas, and then to work together. It doesn't mean that we have to be all the time together, but it's a matter that you know that out there it's a person that might be of support, or is saying a good word to you in a certain moment when you are demotivated, or when you need to charge, and I think this is important to have such discussions, and looking forward for the next one, and thanks to everyone that stayed almost 2 hours in this discussion. Have a wonderful day.
Thank
You
you.
too. Bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Ramonam.